Good morning, crime community. I'm here to continue to read Edgar Allan Poe, The Rationale of Verse. The ancient verse read aloud is in general musical and occasionally very musical. Scanned by the prosidial rules, we can, for the most part, make nothing of it whatever. In the case of the English verse, the more emphatically we dwell on the divisions between the feet, the more distinct is our perception of the kind of rhythm intended. In the case of the Greek and Latin, and more we dwell, the less distinct is this perfection. To make this clearer by an example, now in reading these lines, there is scarcely one person in 1,000 who, if even ignorant of Latin, will not immediately feel and appreciate their flow, their music. The prosodist, however, informs the public that the scansion runs thus. Now, I do not deny that we get a certain sort of music from the lines if we read them according to the scansion, but I wish to call attention to the fact that this scansion and the certain sort of music which grows out of it are entirely at war not only with the reading flow, which any ordinary person would naturally given the lines, with the reading flow universally given them, and even never, but even the most obstinate and stolid of scholars. And now these questions are forced upon us. Why exists this discrepancy between the modern verse with its scansion and the ancient verse with its scansion? Why in the former case are there agreement and representation, while in the latter there is neither one nor the other? Or to come to the point, how are we to reconcile the ancient verse with the scholastic scansion at all? The absolutely necessary conciliation, shall we bring it about by supposing the scholastic scansion wrong because the ancient verse is right, or by maintaining the ancient verse is wrong because the scholastic scansion is not to be gainsaid? Were we to adopt the later mode of arranging the difficulty, we might in some measure at least simplify the expression of the arrangement by putting it thus: because the pedants have no eyes, therefore the old poets have no ears. But, says the gentleman without the eyes, the scholastic scansion, although certainly not handed down to us from the old poets themselves, the gentleman without the ears is nevertheless deducted from certain facts which are supplied us by careful observation of the old poems. And let us illustrate this strong position by an example from the American poet, who must be a poet of some eminence, or he will not answer the purpose. Let us take Mr. Alfred B. Street. I remember these two lines of his. His sinuous path by blazes wound among trunks grouped in myriads round. With the sense of these lines, I have nothing to do. When a poet is in a fine frenzy, he may as well imagine a large forest as a small one, and by blazes of not intended for an oath, my concern is the rhythm, which is iambic. Now let us suppose that 1,000 years hence, when the American language is dead, and learned prodigists should be deducting from careful observation of our best poets a system of scansion for our poetry. Let us suppose that the prosodist had so little dependence in the general and immutability of the laws of nature as to assume in the outset of that, because we lived 1,000 years before his time and made use of steam engines instead of mesmeric balloons, we must therefore have had a very singular fashion of mouthing our vowels and altogether of Hudsonizing our verse. And let us suppose that with these and other fundamental propositions carefully put away in his brain, we should arrive at the line, among trunks grouped in my ryads round. Finding it an obvious iambic rhythm, we would divide it as above, the observing that trunks made the first member of the iambus, and he would call it short, and Mr. Street intended it to be. Now further, if instead of admitting that possibly that Mr. Street, who by time would be called simply Street, just as we say Homer, that Mr. Street might have been in the habit of writing carelessly, as the poet of the prosodist's own era did, and as all poets well do on account of being geniuses. Instead of admitting this, suppose a learned scholar should make a rule and put it in a book in the effect that in the American verse, the vowel U, when found embedded among 9 consonants, was short. What under such circumstances would the sensible people of the scholar's day have a right not only to think, but to say of what scholar, why, what he was, a fool by blazes? I have put an extreme case, but it strikes at the root of the error The rules are grounded in the authority, and this authority, can anyone tell us what it means? Or can anyone suggest anything that it may not mean? Or is it not clear that the scholar above referred to might as readily have deducted from an authority a total false system, a particularly true one? To deduce the authority of constant prosody of the ancient meters, which indeed have been within the limits of the barest possibility, and the task of not being accomplished for the reason that is demanded a species of ratiocination, although out of keeping with the brain of a bookworm. A rigid scrutiny will show that the very few rules which have not as many exceptions as examples, and those of which have by the ancient, the true basis is not an authority, but in the omniprevalent law of simplification, such as the example as the rule which declares a vowel before two consonants to be long. In a word, the gross confusion and antagonism of the scholastic prosody, as well as the marked inapplicability of the reading flow of the rhythms it pretends to illustrate, are attributed first to the utter absence of natural principle as a guide to the investigations which have been undertaken by inadequate men, and secondly to the neglect of the obvious consideration that the ancient poems, which have been the criteria throughout, were in the work of men who must have written as loosely as with little definitive system as ourselves. Were Horace alive today, he would divide with us his first ode thus, and make great eyes when assured by Prosidus that he had no business to make any such division. Maecenas atives edit regibus, et pre sedium et dulce de cosmenum. Read this by Scansion, the flow is preserved, and the more we dwell on the divisions, the more the intended rhythm becomes apparent. Wherever the feet have all the same time, while in the scholastic Scansion, trotchkis, admitted trotchkis, are absurdly employed as equivalent to spondies and dactyls. The book declare, for instance, that Kali, which began the fourth line as a trotchki, and seems to be gloriously unconscious, but to put a trotchki in opposition with the longer foot is to violate the inviolable principle of all music time. It will be said, however, by some people that I have no business to make a didactyl out of such obviously long syllables as sunt, quos, or cur. Certainly I have no business to do so. I never do so, and Horace should not have done so, but he did. Mr. Bryan and Mr. Longfellow do the same thing every day. And merely because these gentlemen now and then forget themselves in this way, it would be hard if some future prosodist would insist upon twisting the Thanopolis or of the Spanish student into a jimble of trotchkis, spondies, and dactyls. It may be said also by some other people that, in the words of Dicas, I have decided or succeeded no better than the books in making the scansel agree with the reading flow, and that Dicas was not pronounced Dicas. I reply that there can be no doubt of the word having been pronounced, in this case, Dicas, and it must be observed that the Latin inflection or variation of the word, it is terminating syllable, caused the Romans must have caused them to pay greater attention to the termination of the word than its commencement, and that we do to the termination of our words. Thus, the end of the Latin word established that relation of the word with other words which we establish by prepositions or auxiliary verbs. Therefore, it will be seeming infinitely less odd to them than it does to us to dwell at any time for any slight purpose abnormally on a terminating syllable. In verse, this license, scarcely a license, would be frequently admitted. These ideas unlock the secret of such lines as Legoris ingenis inventa sub isilia sus, and the Purian Montes e necessita ridiculus lamus, which I quoted some time ago while speaking of rhyme, as regardless to the prosaidal elision, such as that of rem before o in Peruvian Olympian, and it is really difficult to understand how dismally sully a notion could have entered the brain even of a pedant, where all demanded of me why the books cut off one vowel before another. I might say it is perhaps because the books think that since a bad reader is so apt to slide into one vowel, into another at any rate, it is just as well to print them ready slided. But in the case of the terminating M, which is the most readily pronounced of all consonants, as the infantile mama will testify, and the most impossible to cheat the ear, of by any system of sliding. In the case of the M, I should be driven to reply that, to the best of my belief, that the prosodists did the thing because they had a fancy for doing it and wished to see how funny it would look after it was done. The thinking reader will perceive that from the great facility with which M may be enunciated, it is admirably suited to form one of the rapid short syllables of the bastard didactyl, proverbian O, but because the book had no conception of a bastard didactyl, they knocked it on the head at once by cutting off its tail. Let me now give a specimen of the true scansion of another Horatian measure, embodying an instance of proper elision. Integer vitae celerescius pirius, non eget marisi jaculus ne egurti. Here, the regular recurrence of the bastard dactyl gives great animation to the rhythm. The E before the A in the Q arcu is almost as sheer necessity cut off, that is to say, run into the A so as to preserve the spondee. But even this license it would have been better not to take. Had I space, nothing would afford me greater pleasure than to proceed with the scansion of all the ancient rhythms and show us how easily, by the help of the common sense, the intended music of each and all can be rendered instantaneously apparent. But I have already overstepped my limits and must bring this paper to an end. I will never do, however, to admit all mention of the heroic hexameter. I began the process by suggesting of the spondee of the first step towards verse, but the innate monotony of the spondee has caused its disappearance as the basic of rhythm from all modern poetry. We may say indeed that the French heroic, the most wretchedly monotonous verse in existence, is to all intents and purposes spondaic. It is not designedly spondaic, as if the French were ever to examine it at all, and they would no doubt pronounce it iambic. It must be observed that the French language is strangely particular in this point, that it is without accentuation and consequently without verse. The genius of the people, rather than the structure of the tongue, declares that the word are and the most part enunciated with the uniform dwelling on each syllable. For example, we say syllabification, the Frenchman would say syllabification, dwelling no one of the syllables with any noticeable particularity. Here again, I put an extreme case in order to be well understood, but the general fact is that I give that, comparatively, the French have no accentuation, and there can be nothing worth in the name of the verse without. Therefore, the French have no verse worth the name, which is in fact, put in sufficiently plain terms, their iambic rhythm so superabounds in absolute spondees as to warrant me in calling its basis spondaic. But French is the only modern tongue which has any rhythm with such basis, and even in the French it is, as I have said, unintentional. Admitting, however, the validity of my suggestion that the spondee was the first approach to verse, we should expect to find first the natural spondees words, each forming just as spondee, most abundant in the most ancient languages, and secondly, we should expect to find spondees forming the basis of the most ancient rhythms. These expectations are in both cases confirmed. Of the Greek hexameter, the intentional basis is spondaic. The dactyls are the variations of the theme. It will be observed that there is no absolute certainty about their points of interposition. The pensulate foot is, it is true, is usually a didactyl and not uniformly so, while the ultimate on which the ear lingers is always a spondee. Even that the pens ultimate is usually a dactyl may be clearly referred to as the necessity of winding up with the distinctive spondee. In corroboration of this idea, again, we should look into find the penultimate spondee most unusual in the most ancient verse, and according to find it more frequent in the Greek than in the Latin hexameter. But besides all this, spondees are not only more prevalent in the heroic hexameter than dactyls, but occur in such an extent as to even unpleasant to modern ears on account of monotony. What the modern chiefly appreciates and admires in the Greek hexameter is the melody of the abundant vowel sounds. The Latin hexameters really please very few moderns, although so many pretend to fall into ecstasies about them. In the hexameters quoted several pages ago from Silius Italicus, the preponderance of the spondee is strikingly manifest. Besides the natural spondees of the Greek and Latin, numerous artificial runs arise in the verse of these tongues on account of the tendency which inflection has to throw full accentuation in terminal syllables, and the preponderance of the spondee is further inspired by the comparative infrequency of the small prepositions which we have to serve us instead of case, and also the absence of the diminutive auxiliary verbs with which we have to take eke out of the expression of our primary ones. These are the monosyllables whose abundance serve to stamp the poetic genius of the language as tripping or didactylic. Now, paying no attention to these facts, Sir Philip Sidney, Professor Longfellow, and innumerable other persons, more or less modern, have busied themselves in constructing what they suppose to be English hexameters on the model of the Greek. The only difficulty was that, leaving out the question of the melodious masses of vowels, these gentlemen never could get their English hexameters to sound Greek. Did they look Greek? That should have been the query, and the reply might have led to the solution of the riddle. In placing a copy of ancient hexameters side by side with a copy in similar type of such hexameters as Professor Longfellow or Professor Felton or the Frog-Pundian professors collectively are in the shameful practice of composing on the model of the Greek, it will be seen that the latter hexameters, not professors, are about 1/3 longer to the eye on an average than the former. The more abundant dactyls make the difference, and it is the greater number of spondees in the Greek than in the English, in the ancient than in the modern tongue, which have caused it to fall out that while these eminent scholars were groping about in the dark for the Greek hexameter, which is a spondaic rhythm, varied now and then by dactyls, they merely stumbled to the lasting scandal or relationship over everything which, on account of its long-leggedness, we may as well have termed a Feltonian hexameter, and which is a didactic rhythm interrupted rarely by artificial spondees, which are no spondees at all, and which are curiously thrown in by the heels of all kinds of improper and impertinent points. Here is a specimen of the Longfellowian hexameter. Also, the church with, it was adorned with, this was the season, in which the young their parents hoped, and the loved ones of heaven should at the foot of the altar renew the vows of their baptism. Mr. Longfellow is a man of imagination, but he can imagine that any individual with a proper understanding of the danger of lockjaw would make the attempt of twisting his mouth into the shape necessary for the emission of spondees as parents, and from the or such dactyls as cleaned, and the loved ones of baptism is by no means a bad spondee, perhaps because it happens to be a dactyl, and all the rest, however, I am dreadfully ashamed. But these feet, dactyls, and spondees altogether should thus be at once into the proper position. There is a respectable prose, and it will incur no danger of either getting its character ruined by anybody mistaking it for verse. Even when we let these modern hexameters go as Greek and merely hold them fast in their proper character as Longfellowian or Feltian or Frog-Pundian, we must still condemn them as having been committed as a radical misconception of the philosophy of verse. The spondee, as I observed, is the theme of the Greek line. Most of the ancient hexameters begin with spondees for the reason that the spondee in the theme and the ear is filled with it as with a burden. Now the Feltonian didactyls have in the same way dactyls for the theme, and most of them begin with dactyls, which is all very proper, if not very Greek, but unhappily, this point at which they are very Greek, at this point and precisely at which they should be nothing but Feltonian. They always close with what is meant for a spondee, but to be consistently silly, they should die off in a didactyl. That a truly Greek hexameter cannot, however, be readily composed in English is a proposition which I am by no means inclined to admit. I think I could have managed the point myself. For example, to tell when may we hope to make men of sense out of the pundits, born and brought up with their snouts deep in the mud of the frog pound. Why ask whoever yet saw money made out of a fat old Jew, or downright upright nutmegs out of pine knot? The proper spondee predominance is here preserved. Some of the dactyls are not so good as I could wish, but upon the whole, the rhythm is very decent, and say nothing of its excellent sense. That is the end of the rational verse of Edgar Allan Poe, which leaves it to notes of English verse. And I haven't bored you enough already today. I would like to read one more poem. This is a poem, of course, from the Bronte sisters, and we're going to Emily Bronte. This is called The Death Scene. O day, he cannot die, then thou so far art shining. O sun, in such glorious sky, so tranquility declining. He cannot leave thee now, while fresh west winds are blowing, and all around this youthful brow the cheerful light is glowing. Edward, awake, awake, the golden evening gleams, warm and bright in Arden's lake, arouse thee from thy dreams. Beside thee on my knee, my dearest friend, I pray, when thou to cross the eternal sea wouldest yet 1 hour delay. I hear its billows roar, I see them foaming high, and no glimpse of a further shore has blessed my straining eye. Believe not what they urge of Eden's isles beyond. Turn back from the tempestuous surge to thy own native land. It is not death but pain, the struggles in thy breast. Nay, rally, Edward, rouse again. I cannot let thee rest. One long look that sore reproved me for the woe I could not bear. One mute look for suffering moved me to repent my useless prayer. And with sudden check, the heaving of distraction passed away. Not a sign of further grieving stirred my soul that awful day. Paled at length the sweet sun setting, sunk to peace the twilight breeze. Summer's dews fell softly wetting glen, the glade, the silent trees. Then his eyes began to weary, weighed beneath the mortal sleep, and their orbs grew strangely dreary, clouded even as they would weep. But they wept not, but they changed not, never moved and never closed, trembled still, and still they ranged not, wandered not, nor yet reposed. So I knew that he was dying, stooped and raised his languid head, felt no breath, nor heard no sign, so I knew that he was dead. That's the end of today's lessons for Edgar Allan Poe. If you think there's any truth or like to what I'm saying here, have a nice day. Like and subscribe.